The ground shook beneath Admiral Kess as another explosion rocked the underground bunker. Dust fell from the ceiling like snow, covering the emergency lights in a gray haze that made everything look like a bad dream. He pressed his scaled hand against the cold metal wall and felt the vibrations of the enemy machines digging deeper into his world. Velos Prime had been beautiful once. The twin suns had painted the crystal towers in colors that changed with the seasons, and the floating gardens had fed millions of his people. Now those same towers lay in broken pieces, and the gardens burned with toxic fires that would poison the soil for generations. The Void Swarm had come 3 days ago, and nothing would ever be the same. "Sir, the Eastern Defense Grid just went dark," reported Communications Officer Vale, her voice tight with fear. She had been working without sleep for 48 hours, trying to coordinate what was left of their planetary defenses. Her usual calm had cracked somewhere around the time the orbital platforms had been destroyed, taking 500,000 military personnel with them. Kess moved to the tactical display, watching the red dots that represented enemy forces spreading across the surface of his world like an infection. Each dot meant thousands of the insectoid creatures that had poured from their black ships, cutting through Alterian defenders with mechanical precision. His people were artists and philosophers, scientists and teachers. They had never learned how to kill efficiently, and now they were paying the price. "What about the civilian evacuation centers?" he asked, though he already feared the answer. Vale's mandibles clicked nervously. 7 of 12 centers have gone silent. The swarm isn't taking prisoners, sir. They're harvesting biological material and mineral resources, then moving on. Estimated time before they reach our position is 4 hours. 4 hours. Kess thought about his daughter, who had been visiting the university on the northern continent when the attack began. He thought about his wife, who had died 2 years ago in a transport accident and would never see what became of their world. He thought about the children in the schools, the elderly in the care centers, the artists in their studios who had spent their lives creating beauty instead of weapons. Defense Minister Orth looked up from his own console, his face pale with exhaustion. "Admiral, we need to consider the emergency protocols." Everyone in the bunker knew what that meant. The Galactic Federation had established procedures for exactly this situation, though no one had ever expected to use them. There were emergency frequencies that could reach every civilized species within 50 light years, calling for immediate military assistance. Most of those species could have fleets here within days, maybe hours, if they pushed their engines hard enough. But there was one frequency that had never been used, one species that everyone agreed should remain a last resort. The humans had been contacted only 37 years ago, when their primitive radio signals had finally reached Federation monitoring stations. The first diplomatic teams had returned with reports that made even the most aggressive species uncomfortable. Humans were violent in ways that defied understanding. They had fought wars against their own kind for thousands of years, developing weapons and tactics that most Federation species couldn't even imagine. Their planet was a graveyard of extinct civilizations, all destroyed by human expansion and resource consumption. When the Federation had finally made official contact, the consensus had been clear. Humanity needed to be contained. "The quarantine protocols are very specific," Orth continued, consulting his diplomatic database. "Human military vessels are restricted to a 40-light-year sphere around their home system. They are not to be contacted for military assistance under any circumstances." "And if we break those protocols?" Kess asked, though he suspected he already knew. The Federation Council would be displeased. There could be sanctions, trade restrictions, possibly even expulsion from the Federation itself. Another explosion shook the bunker, this one close enough to crack one of the display screens. Emergency. Lighting flickered, and somewhere in the distance they could hear the distinctive whine of swarm-cutting beams working through the upper levels of their shelter. "Sir," Vale said quietly. the long-range transmitter is still operational. We could send a general distress signal to all Federation species, but the nearest military fleet is 6 days away. Or... She paused, her hands hovering over the control panel. The human territory is only 37 light-years from here. They would receive our signal first. Kes closed his eyes and tried to imagine what his world would look like in 6 days. The swarm would have stripped every useful resource and moved on to the next system. There would be nothing left but empty cities and poisoned ground. His people would be extinct, remembered only in the Federation's cultural databases. "What do we know about human military capabilities?" he asked. Orth pulled up the classified files that most Federation citizens never saw. Their ships carry weapons that could crack small moons. They use kinetic bombardment, nuclear warheads, and something called directed energy weapons that can burn through any known armor. Their ground forces... He paused, looking uncomfortable. Their ground forces are trained from childhood to kill efficiently. They practice warfare like other species practice music. But they are rational beings, Vale added hopefully. The diplomatic reports suggest they can be reasoned with, that they have ethical codes governing their military actions. Ethical. Codes written by a species that conquered their entire planet through violence, Orth muttered. The tactical display updated again, showing swarm forces breaking through the last outer defenses. Red indicators were spreading like blood through the city above them, each one representing the death of everything Kes had spent his life protecting. He thought about the stories that came from the border systems, whispered tales of human merchants, and explorers who had somehow slipped past the quarantine. They spoke of a species that could be generous and cruel in equal measure, whose capacity for both creation and destruction seemed to know no limits. The humans built beautiful art and terrible weapons with the same enthusiasm, loved their families, and slaughtered their enemies with equal passion. "Send the signal," Kes decided, his voice steady, despite the fear in his hearts. "All frequencies, maximum power. Include our complete cultural database, our history, our art, everything we are. If we're going to die, at least someone should remember us." Vale's hands moved across the control panel with practiced efficiency. "What should we tell them about the threat level?" "Everything. The swarm's capabilities, their tactics, the number of systems they've already consumed, and..." Kes paused, thinking about what might motivate a species that the galaxy feared almost as much as extinction itself. "Tell them that 17 worlds have already fallen, with hundreds of millions dead. Tell them that no one else answered our calls for help." The quantum transmitter hummed to life, encoding their desperate message into packets of information that would travel faster than light across the galaxy. The signal contained everything the Alterians could compress into a single burst. Their plea for help, their location, tactical data about their enemy, and a complete record of their civilization. As the transmission launched into the void, Kes found himself wondering what kind of response they might receive. Would the humans ignore them, as the Federation had ignored so many other worlds? Would they demand payment, territory, resources in exchange for their help? Or would they do something even worse, something that would make the Alterian survivors wish they had died with their world? He looked around the bunker at the faces of his people, scientists and artists who had never hurt anyone in their lives, now huddled in an underground shelter waiting for death or salvation. The irony was bitter. They had spent centuries building a peaceful civilization, only to discover that peace was a luxury that depended on someone else's willingness to fight. The signal raced through subspace, carrying with it the dying breath of a gentle species and an invitation to violence that would change the galaxy forever. In the darkness between stars, faster-than-light communications relays picked up the transmission and forwarded it along predetermined routes, each relay bringing the message closer to its destination. 37 light-years away, in a system that most of the galaxy preferred to forget existed, Human monitoring stations would soon detect an alien distress call, and for the first time in decades, the galaxy would discover what happened when someone was desperate enough to ask humanity for help. Deep in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, the monitoring station Watchdog 7 had been listening to the galaxy's radio chatter for 37 years. Most of the time, the intercepted communications were routine trade negotiations, scientific conferences, or cultural exchanges between Federation species. The three-person crew had grown used to the peaceful, diplomatic tone of galactic civilization. Senior communications specialist Diana Chen had been staring at the same frequency analysis for 6 hours when the quantum receiver suddenly screamed, to life with priority alerts. The sound was so unexpected that she knocked over her coffee mug, sending the dark liquid splashing across her workstation. She had never heard the emergency tone before, not in 8 years of monitoring duty. "What the hell was that?" muttered technical specialist Rodriguez from across the cramped control room. He was supposed to be calibrating the long-range sensors, but the alert had startled him out of his concentration. Diana's hands moved quickly across her control panel, bringing up the signal analysis software that had been gathering dust for years. The Federation species almost never used emergency frequencies, preferring to route even urgent communications through proper diplomatic channels. This signal was different. It was broadcasting on every available frequency simultaneously, with the kind of power output that suggested absolute desperation. "It's a distress call," she announced, her voice tight with concentration. "Multiple alien languages, but the translation matrix is handling it. Location?" She paused, checking the stellar coordinates against their navigation database. "Velos. Prime. About 37 light-years out. That's in Alterian space." Station Commander Williams floated over from the observation deck, his movements careful in the low-gravity environment. He was old enough to remember the early days of human-alien contact, when every intercepted transmission had been analyzed for possible threats or opportunities. Those days were supposed to be over, ended by the quarantine protocols that had restricted human expansion and kept them isolated from galactic politics. "Put it on speakers," Williams ordered. The control room filled with the translated voice of an alien who sounded like he was watching his world die. "This is Admiral Kess of the Alterian Defense Force to any vessel receiving this transmission. We are under attack by an unknown hostile force designated the Void Swarm. Our planetary defenses have failed. Civilian casualties are estimated in the millions and climbing. We are a peaceful species with no military capability sufficient to resist these invaders." Diana felt her blood run cold as the message continued. She had studied the Alterians during her training, knew them as one of the Federation's most advanced civilizations. They were artists and scientists, philosophers and engineers who had never fought a major war in recorded history. If they were calling for help, the situation had to be beyond desperate. "They have consumed 17 worlds in our sector," the alien voice continued. "Showing no mercy to civilian populations, no interest in communication or negotiation. They strip mine planets for resources and move on, leaving nothing behind but empty space. We estimate 4 hours before our final defenses collapse." Rodriguez had stopped pretending to work on the sensors and was staring at the speakers with growing horror. 17 worlds? How many people is that? "Billions," Williams said quietly. "The Alterians alone have a population of 12 million, on Velos Prime, and that's just their capital world." The distress call played through to its conclusion, ending with a desperate plea that made Diana's chest tighten with emotion. "To anyone receiving this message, we are transmitting our complete cultural database in the hope that some memory of our civilization will survive. Please remember us." The control room fell silent except for the hum of electronic equipment and the distant vibration of the station's life support systems. Diana had spent years listening to the peaceful communications of the galactic community, but this was something entirely different. This was a species facing extinction, begging for someone to help them survive. "Commander," she said slowly, "they're broadcasting on all frequencies, which means this signal is reaching every species within 50 light years. The Federation Council, the Centauri Republic, the Hegemony, everyone." "And?" Williams asked, though his expression suggested he already knew where this was leading. "We're the closest. Even if every Federation fleet dropped what they were doing and headed for Velos Prime right now, they wouldn't arrive for at least 6 days. The Alterians will be extinct by then." Williams moved to his command station and began pulling up classified military databases that civilian monitoring stations weren't supposed to have access to. His security clearance was a relic from his days as a naval intelligence officer, before he had been assigned to what everyone assumed was a quiet monitoring post on the edge of human space. "The Third Fleet is conducting training exercises in the Jupiter system," he announced after a few minutes of searching. 47 ships, full combat readiness, under the command of Admiral Ross. They could reach Velos Prime in 18 hours if they pushed their engines hard. "But the quarantine protocols," Rodriguez objected. "We're not supposed to leave human space without Federation authorization. The diplomatic consequences won't matter if there's no one left alive to complain about them," Williams interrupted. He was already composing a priority transmission to Fleet Command, his fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. Diana watched the sensor displays as she tried to imagine what was happening on Velos Prime. She had visited Alterian cultural sites through virtual reality programs, had studied their art and music during her xenology training. They were gentle beings who had spent centuries building a civilization based on cooperation and peaceful coexistence. The idea of them facing extinction while the galaxy's military forces debated proper procedures made her feel sick. "There's something else," she said, highlighting a section of the distress call that the translation matrix had flagged as significant. "They specifically mentioned that they've tried to contact other Federation species for help. No one responded." "What? Do you mean no one responded?" Rodriguez demanded. "I mean exactly what I said. The Federation Council, the Centauri fleets, the Hegemony's defense forces, even the smaller species with military capabilities. They all received this distress call hours ago, and none of them have sent help." Williams stopped typing and stared at her. "Are you certain about that?" The Alterians included a list of all previous transmissions in their cultural database. "They've been calling for help for 6 hours. The Federation species are either too far away to respond in time, or they're choosing not to respond at all." The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The Galactic Federation prided itself on being a peaceful alliance dedicated to mutual aid and cooperation, but when one of their member species faced extinction, they had apparently decided that proper procedures were more important than saving lives. "Send the message to Fleet Command," Williams decided. "Priority Alpha, full military encryption. Include everything, the distress call, our analysis, and a recommendation for immediate military intervention." "Sir," Diana said carefully, "if we do this, there's no going back. The Federation will know that we broke the quarantine, that we interfered in galactic politics without authorization. They could impose sanctions, cut off all diplomatic contact, maybe even declare us a hostile species." Williams looked at her with the kind of expression she had only seen in old war movies, the look of someone who had already made a decision that would change everything. "Specialist Chen, in your professional opinion, what will happen if we don't intervene?" Diana thought about the numbers she had calculated while analyzing the distress call. 12 million Alterians dead within hours. The Void Swarm will consume their planet's resources and move on to the next system. Based on their expansion pattern, they'll hit 3 more worlds within the next month, and they'll keep expanding until someone stops them or they run out of targets. And the Federation's response? Based on their historical patterns, they'll form a committee to study the threat, debate appropriate countermeasures, and eventually agree on a diplomatic solution that arrives approximately 6 months too late to save anyone. Williams nodded grimly and began typing again, his message to Fleet Command growing longer as he included detailed tactical assessments and strategic recommendations. "Then we make the choice for them. Rodriguez, Prepare a response transmission to Velos Prime." "What should we tell them?" Rodriguez asked. Williams paused in his typing, considering the weight of his next words. Humanity had been isolated from galactic politics for decades, viewed with suspicion and fear by species who remembered their violent history. Most humans had accepted the quarantine as the price of peaceful coexistence, content to explore their local star system and develop their own civilization. But now someone was dying, and they had asked for help. "Tell them that help is coming," Williams decided. "Tell them to hold their positions for 18 hours, and tell them—" He smiled, and it was not a gentle expression. "Tell them that when humans answer a distress call, we don't just send help, we send consequences." The transmission raced through subspace toward the Third Fleet's training grounds, carrying with it humanity's decision to step back onto the galactic stage. Admiral Ross would have a choice to make: follow regulations and let millions die, or break the quarantine and face whatever consequences followed. Diana watched the signal disappear into the void and wondered what kind of galaxy they were about to create. The age of human isolation was about to end, and she suspected that nothing would ever be the same again. The first human boot to touch Altarian soil belonged to Sergeant Torres of the 3rd Marine Division, and it landed in what had once been a beautiful garden. The exotic flowers that had taken decades to cultivate were now burning husks, their bioluminescent petals scattered like dying stars across ground that had been torn apart by artillery fire. She could smell the smoke and chemical residue through her armor's filtration system, along with something else that made her jaw clench with anger. "Contact front," she reported into her comm unit, raising her rifle as movement flickered between the twisted metal sculptures that had once been artistic masterpieces. Multiple hostiles, approximately 200 meters north of Landing Zone 3. Around her, 11 other Marines were spreading out in combat formation, their movements fluid and coordinated despite the alien terrain. They had been training for this kind of operation their entire careers, but none of them had ever expected to fight on a world where the enemy had been harvesting civilians for biological resources. "Copy that, ground team," came the voice of Lieutenant Blake from their orbital command post. "Be advised, we're reading massive swarm activity in the underground complexes. The Altarian survivors are holed up approximately 3 kilometers below your position." Torres adjusted her helmet display, bringing up the tactical overlay that showed the maze of tunnels and bunkers that honeycombed the planet's crust. The Altarians had built their cities to blend with the natural environment, creating underground networks that were works of art in their own right. Now those same tunnels were filled with hostile aliens who had been systematically hunting down every living being they could find. The first Void Swarm drone that emerged from the rubble was unlike anything in their training simulations. It stood over 2 meters tall, its carapace gleaming with cybernetic enhancements that reflected the dying light from the burning city above. 6 legs moved with mechanical precision, while its upper arms ended in cutting implements that could slice through steel like paper. Worst of all were the eyes, compound sensors that tracked movement with inhuman efficiency, calculating the most effective methods of harvesting organic material. "Ugly bastards, aren't they?" muttered Corporal Rodriguez, taking aim with his heavy plasma rifle. "Rules of engagement, Sarge?" Torres thought about the civilian casualty reports they had received during their descent, about the children who had been hiding in schools when the swarm arrived, about the artists and teachers who had never hurt anyone in their lives. "There are no prisoners in this fight, Rodriguez. Anything that moves and isn't Altarian gets eliminated." The battle that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had seen in centuries. Federation species fought wars through long-range engagement, using energy shields and precision weapons to minimize collateral damage. They had committees that studied the ethics of battlefield tactics, regulations that governed the treatment of enemy combatants, and protocols designed to limit the destruction of cultural sites. Human Marines had no such restrictions. Torres's, Rifle opened up with a stream of superheated plasma that cut through the lead drone's carapace like butter, sending chunks of cybernetic flesh spinning through the air. Rodriguez's heavy weapon added its own contribution, turning two more drones into scattered metal and biological components. The remaining swarm forces tried to adapt, spreading out and using the ruined landscape for cover, but they had never faced an enemy that fought like humans. "Movement on the left flank," reported Private Wilson, her voice calm despite the chaos around her. She had been a hunter in civilian life, tracking deer through the forests of Montana, and the skills translated surprisingly well to hunting alien invaders. Her sniper rifle cracked once, twice, 3 times, and 3 more drones fell with precise shots to their central processing units. The Marines advanced through the ruined city with methodical efficiency, clearing buildings and underground passages. With tactics that would have horrified the Federation's military observers, they used explosive charges to collapse tunnel entrances, trapping swarm forces in kill zones where escape was impossible. They coordinated artillery strikes from orbit to eliminate large concentrations of enemies, accepting collateral damage to infrastructure that the Alterians would rather preserve. Most shocking of all, they used psychological warfare in ways that the civilized galaxy had never imagined. "All units, this is Torres," she announced over the general comm channel, her voice carrying clearly through the smoke and destruction. "Music time, Marines! Let them know we're here." What followed was something that would become legendary in the military academies of a dozen different species. 12 human voices raised in harmony, singing songs from Earth's military history while they fought through alien ruins. The words meant nothing to the Void Swarm's collective consciousness, but the sound itself was something beyond their programming. Pure, defiant human emotion expressed through violence and art in equal measure. The effect on the swarm drones was immediate and devastating. Their hive mind had been designed to process tactical data, casualty reports, and resource allocation algorithms. It had no framework for understanding why their enemies were producing complex auditory patterns while simultaneously demonstrating superior combat effectiveness. The confusion lasted only seconds, but in combat, seconds were enough to determine victory or defeat. "Bunker entrance located," reported Corporal Garcia from the advance team. "Heavy blast door. Looks like it's been hit by cutting beams but still intact. No sign of immediate breach." Torres and her squad reached the bunker entrance just as the first explosions began echoing from the tunnels below. The swarm had finally broken through the Alterian defenses and was moving through the underground complex with mechanical precision, harvesting everything useful and destroying the rest. "Breaching charges?" Rodriguez suggested, hefting his demolition. "Pack." "Negative. We do this quiet and fast. Wilson, can you get us through that door without bringing down the whole complex?" The sniper studied the blast door's construction for a moment, then nodded. "Give me 2 minutes and some room to work." While Wilson prepared her cutting tools, Torres opened a comm channel to the Alterian survivors. The translation matrix took a few seconds to establish contact, then she heard a weak voice speaking in accented galactic standard. "This is Admiral Kess of the Alterian Defense Force. Please identify yourself." "Admiral, this is Sergeant Torres, 3rd Marine Division. We received your distress call. Hold your position. We're coming to get you." There was a long pause before the Alterian responded, his voice filled with something that might have been hope or terror. "Sergeant, you should know that the swarm has broken through our outer defenses. They are moving through the complex, and we estimate perhaps 30 minutes before they reach our position." "Copy that, Admiral. We're aware of the situation. Just keep your people safe and let us handle the rest." Torres cut the connection and looked around at her Marines. They had trained for this kind of rescue operation dozens of times, but never in an environment where the enemy was actively consuming civilian populations. The tactical situation was clear. They had 30 minutes to fight through whatever swarm forces were in the tunnels, reach the survivors, and establish a secure perimeter. "Listen up, Marines," she announced, her voice carrying the kind of authority That came from years of combat experience. We've got civilians down there who've been listening to these things hunt them for 3 days. They called for help, and no one answered except us. We're going to show them what happens when humans come calling. Wilson finished her work on the blast door, and it swung open with a groan of tortured metal. The tunnels beyond were dark except for the emergency lighting that cast everything in hellish red shadows. Somewhere in the distance they could hear the mechanical sounds of swarm drones moving through the complex, along with the occasional scream that made even veteran Marines clench their teeth in anger. Rules of engagement remain the same, Torres continued as they prepared to enter the tunnels. No prisoners, no mercy, no quarter asked or given. These things have been murdering civilians for 3 days while the galaxy's military forces debated. Proper procedures. Time to show them what improper procedures look like. The Marines disappeared into the tunnels, their armor lights cutting through the darkness as they began the methodical process of clearing the complex. Above them, the Third Fleet continued its orbital bombardment of swarm positions, coordinating with ground forces to eliminate any possibility of enemy reinforcement or escape. In the deepest bunkers of Velos Prime, 12 million Altarian civilians waited for salvation or death, unaware that the galaxy was about to learn why humanity had earned its reputation for violence. The age of peaceful coexistence was ending, and the age of human consequences was about to begin with the sound of gunfire and the voices of Marines singing their way through alien ruins. Federation Council member Kurth had been in emergency session for 14 hours, and his crystalline physiology was beginning to show stress fractures from the constant tension. Around the circular chamber, representatives from 43 species argued with increasing desperation about what to do with the humans who had apparently decided to ignore every treaty, protocol, and quarantine restriction in the known galaxy. The situation is completely unacceptable, declared Ambassador Voss of the Centauri Republic, his tentacles writhing with agitation. Humanity was quarantined for excellent reasons. Their military intervention at Velos Prime represents exactly the kind of uncontrolled aggression that makes them dangerous to galactic stability. The holographic displays around the chamber showed real-time updates from the battle zone, transmitted by Federation monitoring stations throughout the sector. What they revealed was unlike anything in the historical records of civilized warfare. Human forces were not conducting a careful, measured military operation designed to minimize casualties and preserve infrastructure. They were systematically annihilating every void swarm presence on and around Velos Prime with methods that made even aggressive species uncomfortable. Chancellor Yeth of the Hegemony gestured toward the tactical displays with one of his 4 arms. Look at their weapons. Deployment, kinetic bombardment, nuclear warheads, directed energy weapons that are melting the surface of the planet. They're not conducting a rescue operation, they're conducting an extermination. An extermination that is saving 12 million lives, interrupted a new voice from the chamber's diplomatic section. Admiral Kess of the Altarian Defense Force had been granted emergency speaking privileges, though several council members had objected to allowing testimony from someone who was supposedly in the middle of a combat zone. Admiral, Council President Thon spoke carefully, we understand that your people are grateful for human intervention, but surely you can see the larger implications. Humanity has violated the quarantine, ignored Federation authority, and demonstrated exactly the kind of military aggression that led to their isolation in the first place. Kess's translation matrix rendered his response in perfect galactic standard, but the emotion behind his words needed no technological assistance. Honored council members, 3 days ago, my people sent distress calls to every military-capable species within 50 light years. We included detailed intelligence about the void swarm, casualty reports, and tactical assessments of their capabilities. Do you know how many Federation fleets responded to our call for help? The chamber fell, silent. Several representatives shifted uncomfortably in their specialized seating, while others suddenly found their data tablets fascinating enough to require immediate attention. None, Kess continued. 0 Federation vessels responded to a distress call from a member species facing extinction. The humans received our signal and had a full battle fleet in our system within 18 hours. While you were debating appropriate committee structures, they were saving lives. That's not the point, Ambassador Voss protested. The humans used excessive force, demonstrated no regard for collateral damage, and employed weapons that violate multiple Federation treaties on civilized warfare. Show them the Kepler station footage, Kess suggested quietly. President Thawne looked uncomfortable but gestured to the chamber's technical staff. One of the holographic displays shifted to show surveillance footage from a Federation monitoring post near the battle zone. What the council members saw made several of them physically recoil from their viewing screens. Human Marines were advancing through what had once been a civilian residential area, now transformed into a nightmare landscape of twisted metal and biological debris. The Void Swarm had been in the process of harvesting the area when the humans arrived, and the evidence of their activities was scattered across the ground in forms that were too horrible for most Federation species to comprehend. But what made the footage truly disturbing was not the evidence of swarm atrocities. It was the human response. The Marines moved through the devastation with methodical efficiency, but they were not silent. They were singing. Complex harmonies, in multiple human languages, created a soundtrack of defiant rage that accompanied their systematic destruction of every swarm drone in the area. When they found evidence of what the enemy had been doing to civilian populations, their music became something that could only be described as a battle song, expressing emotions that most Federation species had never experienced. "They're singing while they fight," whispered Representative Zayn of the Aquatic Alliance, her breathing apparatus bubbling with distress. "What kind of species sings while committing acts of violence?" "The kind that wins," Admiral Kess replied, simply. The footage continued, showing human forces coordinating orbital bombardment with ground operations in ways that prioritized effectiveness over precision. They used explosive charges to collapse tunnel systems, trapping swarm forces in underground kill zones. They employed chemical weapons that dissolved swarm cybernetic components while leaving organic matter intact. Most shocking of all, they used psychological warfare techniques that seemed designed to demoralize an enemy that supposedly had no individual psychology to demoralize. "The humans are not conducting warfare as we understand it," observed military analyst Gorth, consulting his tactical databases. "They are conducting what can only be described as artistic violence. Every engagement demonstrates innovation, creativity, and an emotional investment in the outcome that defies standard military doctrine." "Because they're fighting for something," Kess said, his voice carrying across the chamber with unexpected force. Every human soldier on Velos Prime volunteered for this mission. They broke their own government's quarantine orders to answer our distress call, knowing that there would be political consequences. They risked their careers, their freedom, and their lives to save people they had never met. "And that's supposed to make their violations acceptable?" demanded Chancellor Yeth. "It's supposed to make you think about what kind of galaxy we've created," Kess replied. "A galaxy where the most effective military force is kept isolated because we're afraid of their methods. A galaxy where member species can face extinction while the Council debates proper procedures. A galaxy where the only ones willing to fight for justice are the ones we've decided are too dangerous to include." President Thawne called for a brief recess, but the arguments continued in smaller groups throughout the chamber. Some species were calling for immediate sanctions against humanity, possibly even military action to force them back into quarantine. Others were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about Federation military capabilities and response times. In the center of it all, Admiral Kess stood quietly and watched the tactical displays that showed human forces systematically eliminating the last swarm positions on his world. The humans were not fighting like any Federation species he had ever studied. They were fighting like they cared about the outcome on a personal level. Like the death of every civilian was an insult that demanded immediate and overwhelming response. When the session reconvened, President Thawne attempted to restore some semblance of diplomatic order. The Council needs to address the immediate situation. Humanity has violated the quarantine and demonstrated exactly the kind of military aggression that justified their isolation. We need to determine appropriate responses. You need to determine whether you want the humans as allies or enemies, Kess interrupted, because after today, neutrality is no longer an option. The chamber erupted in protests and demands for order, but Kess continued speaking over the chaos. The Void Swarm is still out there. They've consumed 17 worlds in our sector alone, and they're not going to stop with Velos Prime. Your fleets are scattered across the galaxy, your response times are measured in days or weeks, and your military doctrine is designed for conflicts between civilized species who follow the same rules. He gestured toward the tactical displays that showed the final stages of the battle for Velos Prime. Human forces were not accepting surrender from swarm units. They were not taking prisoners. They were not leaving any possibility for the enemy to regroup, escape, or adapt to their tactics. The humans fight wars to win them, Kess concluded, permanently, completely, with no possibility for the enemy to threaten anyone ever again. You can call their methods excessive, uncivilized, or inappropriate, but 12 million of my people are alive today because someone was willing to fight that way. The holographic displays updated again, showing the final destruction of the last swarm vessel in orbit around Velos Prime. Human ships had pursued fleeing enemies beyond the system's edge, ensuring that no survivors could escape to report Federation defensive capabilities or human tactical innovations to other swarm fleets. "What happens now?" asked Representative Morn of the Outer Colony Alliance, speaking for many smaller species who had been watching the debate with growing concern. "Do we punish the humans for saving lives? Do we demand they return to quarantine while the swarm continues expanding? Do we pretend this never happened?" The question hung in the chamber's recycled atmosphere like a toxic cloud. Every member of the council understood the implications of their next decision. If they condemned humanity's intervention, they would be establishing the principle that Federation protocols were more important than Federation lives. If they approved of human military action, they would be acknowledging that their own defensive capabilities were inadequate. "There is another consideration," Admiral Kess added, quietly. "The humans have now demonstrated their military capabilities to the entire galaxy. Every species within 100 light years has received intelligence reports about their weapons, tactics, and effectiveness. The quarantine was always based on the assumption that humanity could be contained. Today proved that assumption was wrong." Ambassador Voss's tentacles writhed with renewed agitation. "Are you suggesting that we should reward their aggression with diplomatic recognition, that we should legitimize their violation of interstellar law? I'm suggesting that you should ask yourselves what happens when the next Void Swarm fleet arrives, and they do arrive, whether you want the humans fighting with you or against you." The chamber fell silent as the implications of that statement sank in. The Void Swarm had been expanding for months, consuming worlds and resources, while the Federation debated appropriate responses. Intelligence reports suggested that the destroyed fleet at Velos Prime was only a small fraction of their total forces, possibly a scouting group sent to test Federation defenses. If that was true, then the main swarm force was still out there, somewhere, analyzing the tactical data from their defeated scouts and preparing for a larger offensive. The question was no longer whether humanity should be allowed to participate in galactic affairs. The question was whether the galaxy could afford to face the next crisis without them. Chancellor Yeth spoke first, his voice heavy with reluctant acceptance. "The military analysis is clear. Human forces eliminated a threat that had defeated 17 worlds in less than 6 months. Their response time, tactical innovation, and combat effectiveness exceed anything in our current defensive capabilities. But their methods," Ambassador Voss began. "Worked," Yeth interrupted. "They worked completely, efficiently, and with minimal Federation casualties. We can debate the ethics of their approach after we've ensured that there are enough survivors left to have the debate." President Thawne looked around the chamber, reading the political currents that would determine the galaxy's future. The smaller species were clearly impressed by humanity's willingness to answer a distress call that the major powers had ignored. The military representatives were studying tactical reports that suggested human capabilities far exceeded previous estimates. Even the most isolationist factions were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about Federation response times and defensive preparedness. "The Council will need to vote on several resolutions," he announced finally. "First, the immediate question of whether to formally censure humanity for violating quarantine restrictions. Second, the broader question of whether to revise our military alliance structures in light of demonstrated threats and capabilities. Third, the practical question of how to coordinate future defensive operations in case of additional swarm incursions." Admiral Kess listened to the political maneuvering with growing impatience. While the Council debated procedures and protocols, his people were beginning the massive task of rebuilding their shattered world. Human medical teams were treating Alterian wounded with techniques that Federation medicine couldn't match. Human engineers were restoring infrastructure with efficiency that amazed civilian observers. Human soldiers were helping to clear debris and search for survivors with the same dedication they had shown in combat. "Honored Council members," he said, interrupting the procedural discussions, "while you debate the political implications of human intervention, there are practical matters that require immediate attention. The Void Swarm will analyze their defeat and adapt their tactics accordingly. Intelligence suggests they have reserve fleets that dwarf the force that attacked Velos Prime. We need coordinated defensive preparations, not diplomatic committees." "And you believe humanity should lead those preparations?" President Thawne asked. "I believe humanity should be included in those preparations," Kess corrected, "along with every other species that has the capability and willingness to fight for galactic security. The age of peaceful isolation is over, whether we acknowledge it or not. The only question is whether we face the future together or allow fear and prejudice to divide us when unity is our only hope for survival." The vote, when it finally came, was closer than anyone had expected. The formal censure of humanity failed by a narrow margin, with smaller species and frontier colonies providing the deciding votes. The resolution to revise military alliance structures passed overwhelmingly, opening the door for human participation in galactic defense planning. The coordination protocols were approved unanimously, establishing joint command structures that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. As the session finally adjourned, Admiral Kess found himself thinking about the human Marines who had fought through the tunnels beneath his world, singing their way through alien ruins while saving lives that no one else had been willing to protect. The galaxy was changing, and he suspected that change was only beginning. The age of human quarantine was over. The age of consequences had begun. 6 months after Velos Prime, the galaxy looked like a completely different place. Trade routes that had been considered secure for centuries now carried mixed convoys of human and alien vessels, their combined technologies creating defensive capabilities that neither species could have achieved alone. Border stations that had once monitored empty space were now bustling military installations where Federation officers learned human tactical doctrine and human commanders studied alien logistics systems. General Patricia Stone stood on the observation deck of New Harmony Station, watching the largest joint military exercise in galactic history unfold in the space around her. 300 vessels from 27 different species moved in complex formations that would have been impossible before human military advisors had introduced concepts like rapid response protocols and integrated command structures. What impressed her most was not the size of the fleet, but how quickly the various species had adapted to working together. "The morning intelligence briefing, General," announced her aide, Lieutenant Commander Parks, as he approached with a data tablet and a concerned expression. "We have a problem." Stone accepted the tablet and began scrolling through reconnaissance reports that made her jaw clench with familiar anger. deep space monitoring stations had detected massive energy signatures in the outer dark. The region, beyond mapped galactic territories where long-range sensors could barely penetrate. The signatures were consistent with Void Swarm fleet movements, but on a scale that dwarfed anything they had previously encountered. "How many ships?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer would be worse than she wanted to hear. "Conservative estimates suggest 3,000 vessels, possibly more. They appear to be massing for a coordinated assault on multiple Federation worlds simultaneously." Stone felt the familiar weight of command responsibility settling on her shoulders. The victory at Velos Prime had bought them time and credibility, but it had also painted a target on the entire galaxy. The Void Swarm had learned from their defeat, adapting their tactics and assembling a force large enough to overwhelm any conceivable defense. Response time estimates? If they maintain current course and speed, first contact in 72 hours. But General? Parks hesitated, consulting his tactical analysis. The target selection doesn't make tactical sense. They're not heading for major population centers or military installations. They're targeting agricultural worlds, research stations, and colonial settlements, places with minimal defensive capabilities but maximum civilian populations. The implications hit Stone, like a physical blow. The Swarm had studied the Federation response to their previous attacks and identified the weak point in galactic civilization. They weren't planning a military conquest, they were planning a harvest. Hit a dozen worlds simultaneously, strip them of biological and mineral resources, then move on before defensive fleets could coordinate a response. "Get me Admiral Martinez," she ordered, moving toward the station's command center. "Priority Alpha, encrypt everything, and start pulling together every available ship in the sector. We're going to need everything we can get." The command center was already buzzing with activity as news of the threat spread through the joint. Command structure. Human officers worked alongside Altarian tactical specialists, Centauri navigation experts, and hegemony communications technicians. Their different perspectives combining to create strategic options that no single species could have developed. "General Stone to the command center," announced Admiral Martinez as she entered, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from months of successful joint operations. "We've got confirmation from 6 different intelligence sources. The Swarm is coming in force and they're not interested in another limited engagement." Stone studied the holographic displays that showed the developing tactical situation. Red markers indicated confirmed Swarm positions, while blue markers showed available Federation forces. The numbers were not encouraging. Even with every available ship committed to defense, they would be outnumbered almost 10-1. "What about civilian evacuation?" asked Admiral Kess, who had become the liaison between human military commanders and Federation political leadership. "Can we get the population centers cleared before the attack begins?" "Negative," replied Captain Chen, the station's logistics coordinator. "We're talking about 12 worlds with a combined population of over 2 billion beings. Even if we started evacuation immediately, we could maybe save 10% before the Swarm arrives." The command center fell silent as the weight of that statement sank in. They were facing the potential extinction of multiple civilizations, and their defensive options were limited by the same peaceful philosophy that had made the Federation vulnerable in the first place. "There is another option," Stone said quietly, her voice carrying to every corner of the command center. "We don't wait for them to attack. We take the fight to them while they're still massing in the outer dark." "A preemptive strike?" Admiral Martinez raised an eyebrow. "General, the political ramifications alone would be devastating. Half the Federation species still consider our intervention at Velos Prime to be excessive force. If we launch an unprovoked attack—" "It's not unprovoked," Stone interrupted. "They've already consumed 17 worlds. Intelligence confirms they're massing for a major offensive against civilian targets. We're not starting a war. We're ending one before it can escalate." Admiral Kess studied the tactical displays with the kind of expression that had become familiar since his people's rescue. 6 months of working with human military doctrine had changed him, given him a perspective on warfare that most Federation species had never developed. "The casualties will be enormous," he said finally. "If we attack their main fleet while it's concentrated, we're talking about the largest space battle in recorded history. Even if we win, the losses on both sides will be measured in the hundreds of thousands." "And if we don't attack?" Stone asked. "If we wait for them to hit those civilian worlds?" The answer hung in the recycled air of the command center like a death sentence. 2 billion civilians against perhaps 50,000 military personnel in the defending fleets. The mathematics of the situation were brutal in their simplicity. "I need authorization from the Federation Council," Admiral Martinez said, consulting her command protocols. "An operation of this magnitude requires political approval, especially since it involves preemptive military action." "The Council will debate for days," Stone replied. "By the time they reach a decision, the swarm will be harvesting civilians. How many of those 2 billion beings are you willing to sacrifice for proper political procedures?" The question echoed through the command center, forcing everyone present to confront the central dilemma of their new alliance. The Federation had been built on principles of peaceful cooperation and diplomatic solutions. Human military doctrine was based on the assumption that some problems could only be solved through overwhelming force applied without hesitation. "There's a third option," Captain Chen suggested quietly. "We prepare for both scenarios simultaneously. Begin fleet mobilization for a preemptive strike while requesting emergency authorization from the Council. If they approve the attack, we're ready to launch immediately. If they refuse, we fall back to defensive positions and hope for the best." Stone nodded slowly, recognizing the political wisdom of the approach even as she chafed at the delay it would create. "How long to assemble? A strike force capable of engaging 3,000 swarm vessels? Every available ship in a 100 light-year radius, stripped from defensive positions and trade route patrols," Admiral Martinez calculated. "Approximately 800 vessels, mixed Federation and human designs. We could have them in position within 48 hours. And our chances of success? Unknown. We've never fought a space battle on this scale, and the swarm has had 6 months to study our tactics from Velos Prime. They'll be prepared for our weapons and combat doctrines." Martinez paused, studying her tactical assessments. "But they won't be prepared for the psychological impact of facing a united galaxy. Every species that's ever lost worlds to the swarm will be represented in our fleet. This won't just be a military operation. It'll be a statement that the age of passive victimhood is over." Stone moved to the communication station and began composing multiple messages simultaneously. Emergency requests to the Federation Council, mobilization orders to every human fleet commander in the sector, and coordination protocols for the largest joint military operation in galactic history. "Get me a secure channel to Earth Command," she ordered. "The President needs to know that we're about to commit humanity to a war that will determine the future of galactic civilization." As the command center erupted into controlled chaos, Stone found herself thinking about the Alterian distress call that had started everything. A desperate plea from a dying world had summoned humanity back onto the galactic stage, and now they were about to discover whether their violent reputation would be the galaxy's salvation or its doom. The age of consequences was reaching its climax, and the next 72 hours would determine whether the galaxy would survive to see a new age of cooperation or fall to an enemy that knew only consumption and destruction. In the depths of the outer dark, 3,000 void swarm vessels continued their inexorable approach toward defenseless worlds, unaware that for the first time in their expansion across the galaxy, someone was preparing to meet them with equivalent violence. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when an unstoppable force met an immovable object, and humanity was determined to ensure that they would be the immovable object that ended the swarm's expansion forever.